My name is Eitan Vass, and I was 41 years old when the sky over Kepara stopped being ours. I remember the morning it began because I was elbow-deep in the guts of an old atmospheric scrubber, swearing at a coolant line that had been weeping for 3 weeks and would not stop. The shop smelled of brake fluid and old coffee. My partner Halden was on the bench across from me, his prosthetic foot propped on a crate, peeling an apple with a knife older than either of us. The apple was real. Halden grew them on the orchard terraces above the salvage yard, and he carried one in his pocket every morning the way other men carried prayer beads. He said the smell reminded him his wife had been a real woman and not a dream he had once. We were not soldiers then. We were salvage hands. Kepara had been a colony world for 80 years, third in the bracket, the kind of place men came to when they had failed at being needed somewhere else. The terraformers had done their work and left us a thin blue sky, 2 short oceans, and a band of grassland that ran along the equator like a green belt cinched too tight. 11 million of us lived under that sky. We grew wheat and barley. We pulled cobalt out of the western shelf. We raised children who had never seen Earth, and who said the word with the same vague reverence a man uses for a town he passed through once as a boy. I tell you this because you need to understand what we lost. Not strategic value, not a fortress world. A field where my brother's daughter chased a goat in the rain and laughed so hard she sat down in the mud and could not get up because she was laughing. A bar called the Crooked Step, where a woman named Imra poured whiskey with too much ice and called every patron darling, and meant it about half the time. A grain silo with a dent in it shaped like a man's profile, because 30 years ago a drunk pilot had clipped it on landing, and we left the dent because it looked like the old administrator and we thought that was funny. That was Kepara. That was what they took. My brother Janos lived a kilometer down the road from the salvage yard, in a low stone house his father-in-law had built before the colony was incorporated. With a tin roof he repainted every spring, because his wife liked the smell of fresh paint. His daughter Myra was 8 that year. She had a goat named Pickle that she had named Pickle, because the goat's first act on arriving at the farm had been to eat a jar of pickles off the kitchen table, jar and all. Myra's hair was the same color as her mother's, dark red, and she wore it in 2 braids that her mother redid every morning. I had been at their house for supper the night before the sky changed. We had eaten lamb and bread, and Janos had poured a rough red wine that he had been keeping back for an occasion, though there was no occasion, and we had drunk it anyway. Myra had fallen asleep at the table with her head on my arm. I had carried her to her bed. I had not known it was the last time I would carry her anywhere. You do not, usually. I tell you this also because I need to. Because I have been holding it for 30 years and the holding does not get lighter. Because the histories will record the regulators and the corridors and the campaigns, and they will not record Pickle the goat or Myra's 2 braids or the wine Janos kept back for an occasion he never named. Someone has to. So I am. The first sign was the silence, not a sound stopping, a sound starting that had no business being there. A low hum, somewhere between a bell and a held breath that came down through the air around 0400 local. Halden looked up from his apple. I set down my wrench. The dogs in the yard did not bark. The dogs had been bred from old earth stock and they would bark at a falling leaf. They were quiet and they were watching the sky, and that was the first thing that was wrong. The second was the color. Above the eastern ridge, a thin ribbon of something the wrong shade of pale was unspooling itself across the dawn. It looked like cloud at first, the way a man's death looks like sleep at first. It was not cloud. It moved against the wind. It was reaching. I went outside because I am, by temperament, a man who walks toward problems instead of away from them, and Halden came with me because he was, by temperament, a man who would not let me walk alone. We stood in the yard with the dogs and watched the ribbon thicken. It poured itself across the sky in long, slow sheets, settling, layering, the way oil settles on water. By full dawn it had covered the eastern third of the horizon. By mid-morning it had reached the zenith and was working west. The colony net came alive an hour later, reports from the orbital relay. The terraform monitoring sats had detected an atmospheric anomaly. Oxygen partial pressure was dropping, carbon was dropping, nitrogen was dropping, everything was dropping. The air itself was being inventoried and removed. A child could have told you what it meant. We just did not yet have a word for the thing doing it. We learned the word 3 days later, when the first one of them came down. In those 3 days the colony tried, in its honest plodding way, to make sense of what was happening. The council convened. The xenobiology team broadcast across the relay. Children were kept home from school. Janos came up to the salvage yard on the second morning, with Myra in tow because Myra would not let him out of her sight anymore, and he and I stood by the fuel tanks and watched the ribbon in the sky and did not say much. Myra held my hand. Her hand was very small and warm. Janos said, "What is it?" I said, "I do not know." He said, "What do we do?" I said, "I do not know that either." Myra said, "Will Pickle be all right?" I said, "Yes, Pickle will be all right." That was the first lie I told her. There would be others. It fell in a wheat field outside Corinth, a farm town 6 kilometers from our yard. I went out with the regional warden and a man named Das from the constabulary, because the warden had asked for someone who could read a piece of unfamiliar machinery, and I was the man in the district who fit that description. I expected a piece of a satellite, a failed drone, some scrap of orbital debris. I drove out in the warden's truck with the dust rising behind us and the morning sun cutting through the haze of the eastern ribbon, and the wheat moving in long, slow waves on either side of the road. The wheat was still alive then. I want you to hold that image. The wheat was still alive. What we found in the wheat was not debris. It was the size of a draft horse, lying on its side, breathing. The shell was the color of wet slate, segmented like a beetle's, but the segments were translucent in places and you could see things moving underneath. Long jointed legs were folded against its body, the way a praying mantis folds its arms. Its head, if you could call it a head, was a fan of pale fronds that opened and closed slowly, tasting the air. Where it lay, it had killed the wheat in a perfect circle around itself, and the dead wheat had gone white, as if every drop of water and every shred of nitrogen had been wicked out of the stalks in the time it took the thing to land. Das had his sidearm out. The warden had her sidearm out. I had a multi-tool in my pocket and I was, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely afraid. The thing's fronds opened toward us. We froze. There was no sound, no signal, no thrum, but I felt something move through my skull anyway, a cold, patient pressure, like a hand resting on the back of my neck from behind. I understood very calmly that I was being read, not communicated with. Read. The way a man reads an inventory tag. Then the pressure lifted, and the fronds folded, and the thing began to dig. Its legs moved with terrible economy. In 90 seconds it had buried itself in the loam of the wheat field, and the wheat around the hole had gone the color of bone for 10 meters in every direction. We backed away. We did not run. Some old animal in us understood that running would draw notice we did not want. That night the colony council convened over the relay and named the thing. They called it the veil because of what was happening to the sky, and because no one could think of anything better, and because by then we already had 30 more confirmed sightings around the equator, and the relay was screaming with reports we could not yet read. The xenobiology team out of the orbital lab had managed a tissue sample from the one in the wheat field, scraped from a shell fragment it had shed in landing. The report came back in a single sentence that the lab director read aloud with her voice gone flat and small. It read, "This organism metabolizes atmosphere directly, and there is no upper bound on its growth." Halden was sitting next to me in the council hall. He said, very quietly, "They are going to eat the sky." I said, "Yes." He said, "We will not be allowed to keep this place." I said, "No." He took an apple out of his pocket, set it on the bench between us, and we looked at it for a long time without saying anything else. The grind began in the second week. By then there were thousands of them. The veil came down in slow, steady drifts, settling into soil, into seabeds, into rock. They did not eat the way an animal eats. They breathed. Each adult drew down a column of air 100 meters wide and laid the carbon and oxygen and nitrogen into its own body as silicate shell. The shell grew. The veil grew. The air thinned. Within a month, the partial pressures over the eastern continent had dropped enough that an unmasked man could not run more than 50 meters without going to his knees. We rigged masks. We rigged scrubbers. We pulled the old emergency atmosphere stockpiles out of the colony bunkers, the ones laid down for storm seasons and methane leaks, and we rationed them. The colony militia, such as it was, organized into ground teams. I was conscripted on day 20 because I could fix things and because there were not enough men who could. Halden was conscripted on day 21 because he would not let me go alone, and because his orchard had been overrun in the night by a veil cluster, and he had nothing left to tend. He carried his last apple in his pocket like a relic. I lost my brother on day 23. The veil came over the ridge above his house in the night. There were 4 of them. Janos and his wife Alice had been sleeping with Myra between them because Myra would not sleep alone anymore, and the masks they had been issued were for 1 face each, and there was no third mask of a size that would fit a child. They had been told there would be more masks. There were not more masks. The veil came down through the kitchen door and breathed in the bedroom, and by the time the militia team reached the house at dawn, there were 3 bodies on the bed that crumbled when the team tried to lift them, and a goat in the yard that the veil had not touched because the goat had run, and a tin roof painted fresh that spring because Alice had liked the smell. The team did not let me see the bodies. The team lead, a woman named Cor, no relation to Tomas, the name is common in this district, sat with me in the warden's truck for an hour while I did not cry and did not speak and did not move. Then she drove me back to the salvage yard and put me to work on a damaged rifle because work was the only thing she could give me, and she knew it. I took Pickle the goat. I tied her in the yard at the salvage yard, and I fed her every morning for the rest of the war, even when there was nothing else to feed her with, even when I had to give her my own ration of dried greens. She lived to be 12, which is old for a goat. She died in her sleep in the spring of the 4th year. I buried her under an apple tree on the slope above Hessen's cradle, in soil we had rebuilt by hand, and I marked the place with a stone. The stone is still there. The tree still bears. I tell you this because I want you to understand what the work was for. The histories will tell you we fought for Kapara. We did not fight for Kapara. We fought for the goat. We fought for the apple tree. We fought for the small things we could still keep alive while everything else was being taken. We fought because if we did not, the small things would die alone and we would not be there to bury them, and there would be no one left to put a stone on the place. That was the work. That was all of it. The rest is just how we got from there to here. They gave us rifles. They gave us a week of training that was mostly a man named Sergeant Roth shouting at us about trigger discipline, while a recording of veil movement patterns played on a screen behind him. They gave us a name. They called us the Corinth Irregulars, because Corinth had been the first town to lose its fields and Corinth men and women were the angriest. Then they sent us out. The first contact teaches you the shape of the war you are going to fight. Ours was at a place called Marrow Crossing, a rail junction in the grasslands where a column of veil had been spotted advancing on the rail line. We dug in along the embankment and waited. Roth had told us that the veil were not fast, not when they were feeding, and that a clean shot to the underside of the fronds would put one down. He was right about the speed. He was wrong about the shot. It was late afternoon when they came. The grass on the embankment was the color of old gold and the wind came in long, slow rolls from the west, smelling of dust and dry seed, and we lay on our bellies in the grass with our rifles propped on our packs and our masks tight against our faces, and we listened to the wind, and to each other's breathing, and to the small dry sound of insects that had not yet figured out the world had changed. Halden was beside me. Tessa Brunn was on my other side, though I did not yet know her name then. Wendell Karsh was 3 places down, a heavy man, a baker breathing hard because the mask did not fit him well and because climbing the embankment had cost him. I remember the back of his neck was sunburned. I remember thinking I should tell him to put his collar up. I did not. There was no time. It would not have mattered. The first one came over the rise at a walk, Franz open, tasting. I had it in my sights. I held my breath. I squeezed. The round struck the underside of the Franz clean. The veil staggered. Then it did something none of us had been prepared for. It folded its head down into its shell, the segments of its back opened like a flower, and out of the cavity rose a second set of Franz, newer, fresh. It tasted the air with them, located me, and kept walking. I shot it 3 more times. Halden shot it 4. Roth, down the line, emptied a magazine into its flank. The veil walked through our fire the way a man walks through rain. It reached the embankment. It killed Wendell Karsh, who had been a baker in Corinth and had volunteered because his shop had been overrun. It killed him by lowering its fronds over him and breathing. He went white inside his clothes in less than a minute. He did not scream. I want you to understand that. He did not have time to scream. His mouth opened once around the edge of the mask, and then his eyes went flat and his hand on the rifle went slack, and the breathing of the thing above him made a sound like a man drinking from a cup, and Wendell was empty. When the veil moved on, Wendell's body crumbled when Roth tried to lift it. There was nothing in him anymore. He had been emptied the way the wheat had been emptied. We pulled back. 12 of us had gone forward. 8 of us came back. We had not killed a single veil. We walked the 4 kilometers to the staging point in silence. Tessa walked beside me. She had not spoken since the embankment. At the staging point she sat on the ground with her rifle across her knees and she said very quietly, "My sister was at Marrow Crossing this morning. She had been visiting our aunt." I said, "I am sorry." She said, "The column came up from the south. The town was south of the embankment." I said, "I am sorry." She said nothing else for a long time. Then she said, "I am going to learn how to kill them, every day. I am going to learn one new thing about killing them every day." That is what she said. She kept that promise. I watched her keep it for 3 years. That was the grind. We learned it slow and we learned it in blood. The veil could be hurt. Heavy ordnance cracked their shells. And once you cracked the shell, the thing inside dried out fast, but they could not be hurt cheaply. A single adult veil took a missile or a sustained heavy weapons barrage. We had 24 field missiles in the colony armory. We had perhaps 100,000 veil on the ground and more coming down every hour. The orbital lab tried to bargain. I will tell you about this part because the histories will skip it. The lab director, a woman named Imani Voss, no relation to me though we joked that we were cousins in suffering, opened a wideband signal toward the descending mass and asked the veil to communicate. She used every protocol the deep survey teams had ever drafted for first contact. She offered location data. She offered language primers. She offered in the end simply the question, "What are you and what do you want?" They answered. That is the part that breaks people. They answered. The response came back through the same channel, in clean colony common, in the voice of the lab director herself, sampled from her own broadcast. It said, "We are the veil. We require the atmosphere of this world. Your continued occupation of the surface is not optimal. Cease respiration and we will process your remains efficiently. Resistance extends the duration of your suffering. The optimal outcome for your species is voluntary cessation." She broadcast the response across the colony net. I think she did it because she could not believe it herself and needed witnesses. I listened to it sitting on the floor of a rail station with Halden and a girl from our unit named Tessa Brunn, and when the recording ended none of us spoke for a long time. Halden said finally, "They asked us to die politely." Tessa said, "Yes." I said, "We are going to disappoint them." Halden put his hand on my shoulder. It was the closest thing to a vow either of us would ever make. The council debated for 4 days. Surrender was on the table. It would have been a clean surrender. The veil had been explicit about that. Voluntary cessation would be processed efficiently. The children would not suffer, the elderly would not suffer, no one would suffer. They had offered us a quiet door. Some on the council wanted to take it. Some of them had children. I do not blame them. I will never blame a man for wanting his daughter to die without pain. But the vote went the other way. It went the other way because a man named Tomas Kor stood up in the council chamber, an old wheat farmer from north of Corinth with arthritis in both hands, and he said one thing. He said, "They are asking us to make their work easier. I will not make their work easier." That was it. That was the line that turned the vote. 11 million people chose the long, ugly fight because a wheat farmer with bad hands refused to make a thing easier for the things that were killing him. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count. The veil could model many things. They could model thermodynamics and chemistry and the rate at which a human body emptied of nitrogen. They could not model Tomas Kor. They could not model spite. We fought them for 3 years. The first year was the worst because we were learning. We learned that the veil hated low pressure. They were slow above 3,000 meters and almost dormant above 5. So we pulled the population back into the mountain ranges, into the highland valleys where the air was already thin and our masks were already standard. We learned that the veil were vulnerable in their molting cycle every 41 days, when they shed shell and were briefly soft. So we mapped molting grounds and we hit them in their molts. We learned that the veil did not coordinate the way a human army coordinates, but the way a body coordinates. There was no general, only signals passed shell to shell, and if you cut a column off from its neighbors, it would still advance, but it would advance dumb, into terrain that an aware enemy would have avoided. So we cut columns off. We blew passes behind them. We funneled them into box canyons and dropped the walls. We learned and we paid. By the end of the first year, there were 6 million of us. By the end of the second, there were 3. Corinth was gone. Marrow Crossing was gone. The orbital lab had been pulled down by something that came out of the high atmosphere and that we never identified properly, and Imani Voss had died with it. Sergeant Roth had died at a place called the Cinder Pass, holding a defile alone with a heavy weapon while we pulled the wounded back. And we had not been able to recover his body, because the veil that killed him had eaten the ground around him for 10 meters in every direction. I will tell you about Cinder Pass because Cinder Pass is the kind of fight you do not put in the histories, and that the men who were there do not talk about, and someone should. It was the 14th month of the war. We had been pushed up out of the Central Plains and into the foothills west of Hessen's cradle. A veil column of perhaps 200 had funneled into the lower end of the pass, following a militia unit that had been bait by accident, and then by design, and Roth had taken a heavy weapon and a stack of demolitions, and gone up the slope alone, because there was no one else who could be spared, and because the column had to be held in the pass long enough for the rest of us to get the wounded across the lateral ridge. He held them for 46 minutes. We could hear the heavy weapon firing the whole time. The bursts got shorter as he ran out of ammunition. Then the bursts stopped and there was a long quiet, and then the demolitions went all at once, the way a man triggers them when he is already underneath. The column was crippled. The pass was sealed. We carried the wounded across the ridge and we lived. Roth did not come back. There was nothing to come back. We held a service for him at Hessen's cradle with no body and no grave, and his name was the first one Brunn carved on the wall. He carved it deep. He took most of an afternoon over it. There were others. I cannot list them all, but I will list some of them because if I do not, no one will. There was Aliza Vorn, a hydrologist from the orbital lab who came down on one of the last shuttles before the lab was pulled down, and who spent 11 months building us a clean water system in the Highland fortress out of scavenged piping and prayer, and who died at her workbench of an aneurysm one night because she had not slept properly in months. There was Pieter Haas, a farmer from north of Corinth, who lost his 3 sons in the first 6 months of the war and who walked into a veil column alone at Three Sisters Ridge with a satchel of explosives and a face that nobody who saw it ever forgot. He took 12 of them with him. He did not say anything before he went. He just stood up, picked up the satchel, looked once at the western sky and walked. There was a girl named Sarah Brunn, Tessa's cousin, who ran our supply line between the lower bunkers and Hessen's cradle for 8 months, who could move a sled across a snowfield in conditions that would have killed a healthy man, who came home one night in the spring of the 2nd year, with the sled empty and her hands burned, and her sister Myra Brunn frozen on the sled, because there had not been time to get her in from the storm, and who went out the next morning anyway and ran the line for another 4 months before a veil found her in a defile and took her too. There was an old man named Adam Riener, a carpenter, who lost both of his legs in the 1st year and who spent the rest of the war in a workshop at Hessen's cradle making rifle stocks by hand because the machine tooling had been damaged, and because the new conscripts kept breaking the stocks on the cheap rifles the council had imported from off-world in the panic of the 2nd month. He made 411 rifle stocks. He was at his bench when he died. His hand was still on a piece of ash wood. These were not heroes. I want to be careful about that word. They were people who had been farmers and bakers and carpenters and hydrologists who had been pulled out of their lives and put against an enemy that did not see them as people, and who did the work anyway. Some of them did it loud. Most of them did it quiet. All of them did it tired. The histories will pick out a few of the loud ones and put them on a wall. The quiet ones are also on the wall in Brunn's hand in the rock at Hessen's cradle. If you go there, look for them. They are most of the names. Halden was still with me. He had lost his other foot at a place called Three Sisters Ridge, to a veil that had broken through our line and put its fronds across his calves before I could shoot it. He had lost his apple at the same place. It had been in his pocket, and the veil's breathing had emptied it like everything else, and when I helped him out of his coat afterward, the apple in the pocket was a husk of pale fiber that crumbled when he touched it. He cried then. He had not cried for his wife who had died in the 1st month. He had not cried for his orchard. He cried for the apple. I sat with him while he cried, and I did not say anything because there was nothing to say and because I understood. We were the Corinth Irregulars still. There were 34 of us by then. Tessa Brunn was our scout. A medic named Oren Kale was our medic. A boy named Lev Kor, old Tomas's grandson, because Tomas had died in year 1 of a heart attack in his sleep, which was a mercy the veil could not deny him, was our youngest and our best shot. I was the unit fixer because I could keep our weapons working and our masks sealed. Halden, who could no longer walk, was our radio. He sat in a hardened bunker in the Highland fortress at Hessen's cradle, and he ran our comms, and his voice in my ear was the closest thing to home any of us had. Year 3 was when we found the thing that turned it. I want to be careful here. I want to be careful because the histories will tell you we won by ingenuity, and that is true, but it is not the whole truth. They will tell you we won by adaptability, and that is true, but it is not the whole truth. We won by something the veil could not model, and the thing we found was just the lever. The hand on the lever was the thing they could not model. The thing we found was a derelict. A veil derelict, a dead one. We came on it in a high pass north of Hessen's cradle, on a scouting run that Tessa had insisted on against my advice, and it was lying on its side in the snow at 4,000 meters, frozen, hollow, dead probably for months. Tessa wanted to look inside it. I told her no. She looked at me with her gray eyes that had not blinked at anything since her sister had died at Marrow Crossing, and she said, "We have to learn something, Eitan. We have to learn something or this ends one way." I let her cut it open. What was inside was not what we expected. The veil were not single organisms. We had assumed they were because they walked alone and fought alone. They were not. Inside the dead one's shell, packed in a chamber the size of a coffin, were dozens of smaller things, pale, soft, blind, no shells of their own, connected to the host's interior by filaments that ran into a central node. The host veil was a body. The things inside were the people. When the host died at altitude, the soft inner things had died too, because they could not survive without the host's metabolism around them. Orrin Cale, our medic, who had been a colony biologist before the war and who had been quiet for the entire walk up the pass, knelt by the opened shell and put his gloved hand against one of the dead inner things. He said, "They are colonial. The shell is the tool. The things inside are the species. We have been fighting their machinery." I said, "Then where is their home?" He said, "The shell breathes for them. The shell takes the atmosphere. They live inside it. The shell is their world." We were quiet for a long time after that. Tessa was the one who said it first. She said, "Each shell is a world. Each shell needs an atmosphere. They came here because they need worlds, and they make new ones by emptying ours." We carried the inner things back. Orrin did 3 weeks of work on them in the lab at Hessen's Cradle, and at the end of 3 weeks he came to me and Halden in the radio bunker with a tablet in his hand, and a look on his face I had not seen in a long time. It was the look of a man who had remembered hope was a tool and was about to use it. He said, "The host shells run on a specific atmospheric chemistry. They tolerate ours, but they have a preferred range. Outside that range, the colony inside dies of stress within days. The host walks dumb. The shell wanders without purpose. It is still dangerous, but it is uncoordinated and it will not feed." Halden said, "What is the range?" Orrin said, "Narrow, very narrow. They tolerate variation of about 4% in nitrogen partial pressure. Above or below that, the colony inside collapses." I said, "We cannot change the partial pressure of a planet." Orrin said, "We do not have to change the planet. We have to change the pockets they walk through. We have to make every valley they cross, every pass they push, every river bottom they hunt in, a place where the chemistry is wrong. We have to poison the air with itself." Halden was already running numbers on his console. He was a salvage hand and an orchard man, but he had been good with numbers his whole life, and his fingers moved over the console the way they had once moved over the bark of his trees. He said, "We have the old terraform regulators in storage, 40 of them. They were laid down to manage atmospheric drift across the equatorial belt during the second decade. They can shift partial pressure in a sealed valley by 6–7% if we modify the throughput. They were decommissioned 30 years ago because the atmosphere stabilized, but the hardware is intact." I said, 40 regulators across an entire continent." Halden looked up from the console. He said, "We do not need a continent. We need the corridors they use. We need to make the corridors uninhabitable to them. We need to herd them into a country where they cannot think." I said, "And then what?" He said, "And then we kill them while they are stupid." It took us 6 months to build it. 6 months of sneaking down out of the mountains in small teams to recover the old regulators from their storage bunkers. The bunkers were scattered across the equatorial belt, in places that had been farmland once and were now bone country, and getting to them meant moving across open ground that the Veil patrolled. We moved at night. We moved in groups of 3. We carried what we could on our backs, and what we could not we left for another team. The regulators were heavy. Each unit weighed perhaps 80 kilos, and had to be cut out of its mounting with hand tools, because the power tools we had left were needed at Hessen's Cradle. We worked by red lamplight, in masks, with the cold of the equatorial nights coming up through the broken concrete of the bunker floors. We learned to recognize each other by silhouette because we could not risk talking. We learned to sign with our hands. We learned to carry a wounded man on a sled across snow without making a sound. 6 months of hauling them up impossible slopes on cargo sleds, because the colony's heavy lifters had been destroyed in the first year. The slopes above the equatorial plain rose almost 2,000 meters in some places and were broken with scree and ice, and we hauled the sleds with ropes and our own backs, 10 men to a sled, breathing into masks that frosted shut and had to be cleared with gloved fingers. A man who fell on the slope was a man you might not get back. A sled that slid was a sled you might not catch. We lost 6 sleds in the 6 months. We lost 11 men with them. We kept hauling. 6 months of modifying the throughput valves by hand in workshops cut into the rock at Hessen's cradle, with me and 3 other fixers working from schematics that were older than I was, and that nobody had updated since the colony was young. The schematics had been printed on paper because the colony archive had not trusted digital storage for the foundational documents, and the paper was yellow and brittle and smelled of dust, and of the long, quiet years of a colony that had thought itself safe. I worked 16-hour days at a bench with a single overhead lamp and a magnifier on a stand, and I came back to my bunk every night with my hands cramped into hooks and my eyes burning, and I slept 4 hours and got up and did it again. We lost people doing it. We lost Lev Kor on the second recovery run, to a veil that came over a ridge nobody had expected to see one on. He died well. He held the veil with rifle fire long enough for Tessa to get the rest of the team into a defile, and then he stayed behind because his leg was broken and he could not run, and because he understood the shape of what we were trying to do. Tessa was the one who shot him before the veil could. He had asked her to. She put the round clean through the back of his head, the way he had asked her to, and she stayed with him for the half-second it took him to be gone, her hand on his shoulder, and then she stood up and walked back to the defile and did not speak for the rest of the day. I will not say more about that. I have said too much already. Tessa carries that. It is hers, not mine, and I should not be telling it. But there is no one else left to tell it, so I am. We lost Oren Kale to lung rot in the 5th month. An old colonist's disease the war had given a chance to come back, because the highland air was thin and his masks had been damaged in a fall and he had not told anyone. He died in his workshop with a regulator schematic on his desk. He had finished the modifications, 3 of them in his last week of work, by himself, with hands that had begun to shake. Halden read his last log entry over the comms to the whole unit. It said only, "Tell them I got the throughput right." We lost others. I will not list them all. Their names are on a wall at Hessen's cradle now, carved by a man named Brunn who lost his daughter at Marrow Crossing and his other daughter in the 7th month of the regulator work, and who carves names because it is the only thing left he can do for them. The wall is long. The wall is, in the end, the only thing about the war I am certain we built right. In the spring of the 3rd year, we put the regulators in. We placed them along the corridors the veil used to move between feeding grounds, the river valleys, the low passes, the funnels of land the columns naturally followed. We placed them in pairs, one at each end of a corridor, to seal the chemistry of the air inside. We tied them into a central command at Hessen's cradle so they could be cycled in sequence. So a veil column entering a corridor would walk into a chemistry that was tolerable at the mouth and increasingly hostile at the throat. By the time the column was deep enough in the corridor to want to turn around, the chemistry behind them would be hostile too. They would be trapped in a country their inner colonies could not survive. We tested it on a small corridor first, a defile north of Hessen's cradle that a veil column used regularly. We cycled the regulators. We watched on the long-range cameras as the column entered. We watched as the veil walked half a kilometer into the defile and then stopped. They stood in place for a long time, fronds open, tasting. Then they began to wander. Not retreat, wander. They moved without purpose, without coordination, into the walls of the defile, into each other. Their feeding cycles went strange. They did not breathe down the air. They did not move on. They stood and they tasted and they did not know where to go. We brought up our heavy weapons. We killed them in the defile in 3 hours, 40 veil. We lost no one. The 3rd movement of the war began the next morning. We rolled it out across every corridor we had instrumented. The veil columns walked into our country and they walked dumb. The shells were still dangerous. A dumb veil could still empty a man if he was careless, but they no longer coordinated, no longer fed efficiently, no longer advanced with purpose. We took them apart in their thousands. We pushed them back across the foothills. We took back the river valleys. By midsummer of the 3rd year, we had cleared the equatorial belt of active veil for the first time since the war began. By autumn we had reached Corinth. Corinth was bone. The town was standing because the veil did not break walls for sport, but the wheat was gone, and the soil was gone, and the orchard terraces above the salvage yard were gone, and the dent in the old grain silo that looked like the administrator was still there, but the silo was empty and the air around it tasted of nothing. I walked through what had been my street. The houses were standing. The doors were open. Some of them had been left open by the people who fled. Some had been opened by the veil in their slow, patient way, by leaning on the wood until the wood gave. I went into Janos's house. The bed was still made. Alice had made it on the morning of the day the sky changed, and no one had unmade it since. The lamb supper plates were still in the sink. The wine bottle was still on the counter. Pickle's water bowl was still by the door. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then I went out and I stood in the salvage yard. I stood in what had been my shop. The bench where Halden had peeled his apple was still there. His knife was on it where he had set it down the morning the sky changed. I picked the knife up. I put it in my pocket. I did not cry. I had cried for everyone I was going to cry for already. Tessa was beside me. She had not spoken in the walk through the town. She said finally, "We are going to have to repair this place from the ground up. The atmosphere, the soil, everything." I said yes. She said, "It will take 100 years. I said, "Then we had better start." We started that afternoon. Tessa marked a patch of bone soil behind the silo with the heel of her boot, a square perhaps 3 meters on a side, and we dug it over with hand tools and we hauled in the first sled of nursed loam from Hessen's cradle the next week. It was not much. It was the beginning of a thing. Someone has to put the first spade in. We did. The veil were not finished. I want to be clear about that because the histories will tell you the regulator campaign won the war, and that is also not the whole truth. The regulators broke the veil columns on the surface. They did not touch the one still in orbit, the descent mass that had been spilling down for 3 years and that still hung above us in a thin, pale veil over the eastern sky. There were veil left. There would be veil for a long time. We would fight them in pockets and in corridors and in the high deserts for the rest of my life, and probably for the rest of my daughter's life, if I had ever had a daughter. But the back was broken. The thing we had to fear was not the veil anymore. The thing we had to fear was the slow grinding work of putting our world back together, with 3 million people instead of 11, with boned soil and thin air, and a sky still patchy with the things that had tried to make us die politely. Halden lived to see Corinth retaken. He lived another year after that, in the radio bunker at Hessen's cradle, his lungs slowly losing the war they had been losing since Three Sisters Ridge, his voice on the comms growing thinner each month but never softer. He directed the regulator network from his console until 2 weeks before he died. He saw the first new orchard planted on the slopes above Hessen's cradle in the spring of the 4th year. He did not see it bear fruit. The first apples came off those trees the autumn after he was buried. I carried one of them down to his grave. I sat with it in my hand for a long time. The grave was a stone in a row of stones on a slope overlooking the valley. The wind was thin and clean, and the sky was still patchy in the east, but it was blue overhead. I set the apple on the stone. I said the thing I had not said when he was alive because we did not say things like that to each other when we could still trade them in silence. I said, "We did not make their work easier, Halden." I left the apple on the stone. The next morning a bird had taken it. That was all right. That was the point. I am an old man now. I am writing this in the spring of my 72nd year, in a house I built myself on a ridge above the valley where the salvage yard used to be. Corinth is being rebuilt slowly down on the plain. The wheat is starting to come back, in patches, in the soil we have nursed for 30 years. There are perhaps 400,000 people in the town now. They are mostly the grandchildren of the survivors. They do not remember the war. They do not remember the dent in the silo, or the bar called the Crooked Step, or the morning the sky changed. That is all right too. That is also the point. The veil are not gone. The shells are still found sometimes in the high deserts and in the deep valleys, and the colony militia still maintains the regulator network and the heavy weapons teams. There are still men whose job it is to walk corridors with rifles and listen for the hum that is not a wind. But the veil come less often now. Their orbital mass has dispersed. Whatever sent them, whatever they are part of, has not come back for them. We do not know if it ever will. I think about that sometimes. I think about whether somewhere out there, in some other system, the species inside the shells is still walking other worlds, still asking other peoples to cease respiration politely, still being told no by some other Thomas core on some other planet. I hope so. I hope the word travels. I hope the species inside the shells learns, eventually, what they did not know when they came to Kepara, which is that there is a kind of animal in the universe that does not die on schedule, and does not make the work easier, and does not let go of its dead, and will haul old terraform regulators up impossible slopes for 6 months in the cold because the alternative is unthinkable, and will do it not because of cleverness, though we were clever, and not because of strength, though we found we had some, but because we will not be parted from each other even when we are parted from each other, and we will hold a dead man's apple in our pocket for a year because it is the last thing he touched, and we will name a corridor after a girl who held it for us, and we will carve names on a wall because we are the kind of animal that carves names. And that is the thing the shells could not model, and never could have modeled, and never will. I keep Halden's knife on the windowsill above my sink. I use it to peel apples in the mornings. From the orchard he never saw bear fruit. The apples are smaller than the ones he used to grow, because the soil is still thin, and the seasons are still strange, and we are still rebuilding the chemistry of the air a valley at a time. But they are real apples, and they smell like apples, and when I sit on the porch in the early light with one in my hand, I sometimes think I hear him laughing at me for taking so long over breakfast. I do not look up at the sky much anymore. The patch in the east is mostly gone. There are clouds over the ridge most mornings, real clouds, the kind that come from the oceans we have been rebuilding, and they move with the wind the way clouds are supposed to move. The dogs in the yard bark at falling leaves. The children in the valley do not know what a veil looks like and have to be shown pictures in school, and the pictures bore them, the way pictures of any old enemy bore the children of the people who beat that enemy. That is fine, that is exactly fine, that is what we fought for. Sometimes a young man comes up the ridge to talk to me, sent by the militia or by the council, wanting to know what it was like. They want stories about the regulators. They want stories about the Cinder Pass. They want to know what we said to each other when we knew the veil could hear us, and how we kept fighting after Corinth fell, and what it felt like to be in the defile when the first column went dumb. I tell them what I can. I leave a lot out. I do not tell them about Wendell Karsh in the wheat field, or about Lev Kor asking Tessa to do what she did, or about Orrin Kale's last log entry, or about Halden's apple crumbling in his pocket on Three Sisters Ridge. Those are not stories for young men. Those are things you carry. I tell them, instead, the only thing I think is worth passing down. I tell them that the veil asked us to die politely and we said no, and that the no was not loud and was not heroic and was not even particularly brave at the time it was given. It was an old man with bad hands at a council table saying he would not make their work easier. That was all it was. The rest came from that. The regulator network, the defile at Hessen's cradle, the retaking of Corinth, the orchards, the children who do not know what a veil looks like. All of it. From an old man at a table who would not make the work easier. I tell them that if they remember nothing else, they should remember that the universe will, from time to time, send something that wants you to stop being a problem, that the thing will be reasonable about it. It will explain. It will offer terms. It will tell you in your own voice, sampled from your own broadcasts, that the optimal outcome is voluntary cessation. And you will be tempted, because you will be tired, and because the children will be afraid, and because the door it is offering will be quiet and clean. And you will say no, not because you are clever, and not because you are strong, and not because you have a plan. You will say no because you are the kind of animal that says no. You will say no because there is a man across the bench from you peeling an apple, and you have known him for 20 years, and you will not be the one to make him die politely. You will say no for him, and he will say no for you, and the next man will say no for both of you, and somewhere down the line that no will become a regulator on a slope, and a rifle in a defile, and a name on a wall, and a knife on a windowsill, and a small real apple in your hand in the early light. That is what I tell them. Then I send them back down the ridge, because the sun is getting low, and I have apples to peel for supper, and there is still work to do tomorrow, and the wind in the valley smells the way wind is supposed to smell, and the dogs in the yard are barking at something that is only a falling leaf. The sky over Kepara is ours again. It was not given back. We took it, and we are not, any of us, ever going to let it go.